Hello, welcome everybody. So it's time to hear stories from these three. We've got Ozzie Clarke-Binns. Ozzie has spent over 20 years as an independent advisor and NED for various organisations, from the Met Police and the London 2012 Games to A2 Dominion Housing Group and the Mayor's Office. He specialises in people and culture transformations. Having previously been Head of Innovation and Consultancy at UCL, a trustee of the RNIB, the Royal National Institute of Blind People, and People Director at Otter. So today, Ozzie leads people teams for fast-changing businesses from aviation to tech. And outside of all this, I didn't know this till Ozzie sent me this brief. He's a film producer working on his first standalone short. Very cool. So, Shona Marsh. Shona is a non-exec at the National Tourist Board, Visit Scotland. It's a non-departmental public body by the Scottish Government, and she's also serving on their Audit and Risk Committee. She's the chair of the board at the charity Disability Snowsport UK. She became a board member for both organisations at 31, succeeding to chair at the charity 2 years into her tenure. Her background is in travel and tourism and then tech startups in the travel sector. Prior to joining both boards, she'd been leading growth for the Airbnb Experiences business in Northern Europe and moonlighted as a ski instructor whenever possible. She currently runs a tech accelerator for the Scottish Government and a tech startup training programmes alongside her board roles. So, Rebecca Robbins. Rebecca works with organisations through the lenses of brand, culture, and leadership. And as we have 5 generations at work for the first time in history, her research and work has evidenced how we can translate our generational diversity into more collaborative and competitive organisations. She has over 20 years' experience working with leading brands from Lego to Louis Vuitton and teaches on leadership programmes at several of the top business schools and universities, including Cambridge and Oxford. She's an advisor to Quilt AI, heralded by The Economist as an AI for Good pioneer. She's the author of 3 best-selling books, most notably 5 Generations at Work. She is known for her problem-solving, collaboration and creativity, and for her engaging way of working. Education is at the beating heart of her purpose, including serving as an advisory board member at the Chartered Management Institute and board trustee at the EY Foundation. So, Rebecca's written a book that's incredibly pertinent to this topic of the mix of generations we have on boards. And Shona and Ozzie have this first-hand experience of becoming board members quite young. First of all, Rebecca, can you set the scene for us? How multi-generational are boards?
It's a brilliant opening question, Sarah. Thank you so much. And I think the answer that I'm sure probably every one of us on this session would align on right now is that we're really missing a key opportunity, especially as you've beautifully articulated. Age is the one dimension of diversity that we all share. So I think multi-generational, to your point, is a key word to dwell on because it has become part of how we talk about our organisations now. But really, it's for a far simpler reason, I think, than media and marketing would lead us to believe. We're living for longer, and therefore we shall want to need to work for longer. And, I think that lens on generational diversity is very much evidenced in the book, is that very strongly rooted in what we share, what we have in common, rather than, again, what media and marketing would lead us to believe that it's much more of a divisive narrative discourse. And I think that's important around the mindset change that we have, whether, we're leading, we're managing, whatever our roles are in organizations and the roles that we are serving on as boards. But I think crucially, again, we have to shift away from this, what we're seeing sometimes still in the media and marketing, instead taking very much a maximizing approach to drawing on what we can all learn from and with each other. And that's certainly, again, what came out loud and clear. So the research, just a very top line on it, was over the course of 5 to 6 years and reached as far as 4 continents. So that wholeheartedly evidenced the fact that the organizations that are leading the field, that are already there or already partway there, are very much taking a maximizing approach to our generational diversity. And I think final point on this before next question is really just to hardwire on this fact that in the same way that we have 5 generations at work, we also have now 5 generations of clients, consumers, our customers. And I love that, we've talked about this before, Sarah, over the years, that, often boards talk about having a seat at the table for the customer. Well, it's ironic, really, when we can have more diversity of seats at the table, which really put each other in the shoes of how are we looking at this through a greater diversity of lenses. So I think, again, if I would encourage any non-com chair as we're getting the conversation going, thinking about when we're conducting board effectiveness reviews and we're thinking about the shape and structure, but what does that tenure look like going forward? And crucially, how can we be more intentional about setting this up for future-proofing our organizations? So I think when one of the top priorities really on the minds of CEOs, as we know through the PwC, Deloitte and et al. Reports, is, will my business be relevant in 10 years' time? This is not a nice to have. This is a must have.
Thank you, Rebecca. That's a great scene setter. And just a couple of stats for you to get us going as well. The average age of non-execs has fallen slightly in Spencer Stuart's 2024 analysis from 60.9 to 60.6. So they're shifting younger, but I'm not sure that's too big a change. I would say the data out there is all about listed companies. So it's not actually that reflective of necessarily the whole of UK and all sorts of different boards. But what they found there is female NEDs are on average 3 years younger at 59 years old, and then their male counterparts at 62 years old. New NEDs have an average age of 58 years old, and first timers on average a bit younger at 56 years old. So gives you a bit of a sense in that sort of FTSE, I think it was 100 or 150, and directors under 40 years old. And the Frasers Group, alongside Auto Trader, has the lowest average age on the board of 51 years. So those are the largest organisations in the country. They don't have a fantastic mix of ages there. And I would say their average age is pushing around the 60 mark. My experience hasn't been that different. So when I joined the board of a specialist bank, the non-execs were an average age of 68 and I was 29. Brought quite a mix there. But Ozzie, can you share a bit of your experience then? How young is too young? Tell me about your first experience of governance.
I think it ultimately is going to come down to you as an individual. My journey is quite unusual in that I had my first board role when I was 13 years old. I spent 6 years as an independent advisor with the Met Police. And at the time, I didn't really know what this thing was and what I was doing, but I joined what was one of their community-based groups. It was helping them advise them both on policing strategy, but also their engagement strategy and working and engaging with young people across the capital, as well as developing policing strategy as it affects young people as well. And that took me everything from responding to the 7/7 attacks and advising the commissioner right down to how to keep young people safe online. And so I think there really is no ideal age, I think, to start. I think the most important thing is not to put yourself out of the race. You have to apply, you have to be part of it if you want to step up and be on the board. And when I joined at 13, I remember putting myself forward, and it was quite a bit different process to this. It was a large room, about 180 young people. And I basically stood up and said, I think I'm the youngest person in this room, and this is about representing the voice of young people across London, and my voice has to count at my age. And I think as I've gone into boards now, I still have a very similar approach. As Rebecca said, as both as customers, clients, consumers, but also as employees and colleagues, it's how do you represent all those different voices and that broad diversity that your organization is going to come into contact with around that board table.
Thank you, Ozzie. And I guess another question maybe comes to you, Shona. Why did you want to become a non-exec in the first place?
I think everyone who's watching this call at the moment is further ahead in their journey than I was when I became a non-exec director, because I didn't do this much research. I've flexed into self-employment quite a lot through my career. I love working with lots of different organizations, doing different projects, and I love problem solving. That sort of led me to startups and tech as well. And a friend had just said, oh, do you know what? I know someone that's a non-exec director and you would make a really great one. I think I was about 27, 28 at the time. And I was like, I don't even know what one of those is. Like, I didn't know that boards existed. I'd worked for the public sector for a while, then I'd worked for startups. Like, they're not mature in the same way as sort of bigger companies. And so that was the first time I'd found out about it. And she pushed me to dynamic boards. And I think you just started at that point. And I had a look at dynamic boards and I thought, actually, yeah, that would be really interesting. And so I was working with a career coach at the time anyway, and sort of suggested it to her. And she said, well, let's explore it and let's see what the opportunity could be, because it's a way for me to professionalize my love of getting involved in lots of different things and being able to influence the way that things happened and solving problems. So that's what sort of led me to it in the first place. And I guess the experience is a little bit different. It's definitely not like being self-employed and working on projects for different company. It's a slightly different role, but she was pushing me in the right direction, definitely.
Yeah, I think one of the big head shifts is kind of when you're involved like in more consulting capacity, you go and you do the project and you walk out.
Yeah.
Whereas when you're involved as a non-exec, you're there for a longer term, hopefully, and you get to really see things through and see what the impact is of that bit of advice that you gave. I'm sure we find that kind of experience, Shona.
Yeah, and I think when you've come from startups and being in control of the operational speed of something, doing it from a board level is very different. I've actually just had my renewal letter this morning for one of my roles. So that's 3 years in this autumn. And you're starting really to see the impact of your earlier work now. And that's the difference as well, is that you're only going to 6 to 8 meetings a year, depending on what your sort of rotation rotation of meetings is like. So actually the ability to move things on at the level it's at, because it's a strategic level and not a delivery level, is very different. And for me, it's very painfully slow, but actually you're moving a huge machine and you're moving into a strategic direction. And for us, that's technology, AI, and other ways of delivering our services. And that takes a lot of work. And so it takes longer, but you see a much bigger impact in the work that you're doing.
And did you have connections to the organisations that you applied for roles with, Shona and Ozzie in particular, in that one?
I didn't know. So I became a trustee first, and then very soon after a board member for Visit Scotland. I knew people in the industry, but I didn't know anyone who worked for the organisations. The first one was my top pick for a trustee role, so I just kept waiting for them to advertise and started to apply. And Visit Scotland was actually advertised on dynamic boards, but my background's in tourist boards, so I'd had experience there before, but didn't know anyone either in the organisation or on the board.
They were more cause driven in the sense that I felt it was important, young people, especially young Black people, police had bad relationships. They were trying to do that and trying to kind of rectify that sometimes. Like, how do I get involved and help support that work? And then RNIB, I have a sight loss condition myself. And so there was an affinity to the organization. So when the opportunity came up, I was like, actually, I would love to play a role in helping shape the organization. I think I've got the skills that they were looking for at the time. And so kind of I applied, and that was how it is. But I didn't know anyone. I think on all the boards I'm on, actually, I haven't known anyone at any of those boards throughout the journey. It's always been kind of an application or someone has reached out.
Then you bring true independence as well.
Yeah.
No prior allegiances, which helps.
Very true.
Yeah, thank you, Ozzie. And Rebecca, can you give a sense of kind of what creative ways are boards trying to gain that younger perspective?
I have to say, I mean, Ozzie, you teed it up beautifully when you said your first board role was 13 years old. I think absolutely. And Shona, again, your point about being approached for a role but not having the awareness, I mean, it's absolutely spot on and so true. I know we've touched on this before, Sarah, which is I am such a big proponent of starting earlier because, again, here we're looking at the FTSE data coming out today around gender diversity and the dimensions of diversity that we're not indexing on. Your point around age, Sarah, we're here in 2025. And we should be so far further on. And second of all, listening to you, Shona, about your point about impact, surely, again, if we can get beyond some of these conversations, we can, get to a higher order level around the impact that we want to really deliver. I'll say, actually, one of my most memorable moments was my very first board meeting at the EY Foundation. The EY Foundation, since its inception, has always had a youth advisory board. And I was sitting next to the chair of our youth advisory board, and her story was absolutely fantastic. She had not only been through a lot of the programs that the EY Foundation offers, she had a first in biochemistry, her career has just taken off. And, this is an organization that supports education, social mobility. It really hardwires the delivering opportunity for people on free school meals. And I think one of the reasons I share that not only as a personal story, but, as we were looking at our next sort of 10 years and how are we, to your point, Shona, that far-reaching strategy where we're not talking about sort of that sense of sort of fast pace, but how are we really going to shift the needle? That's not all going to be stuff that we can measure either. So I think part of the creativity is, one, let's be more intentional earlier. So let's start to thinking about setting up next generation boards. I think that the world of, as we know, probably social purpose has had a leap on this before corporates, known as youth advisory boards, youth councils, and they've done a fantastic job. We're just missing this with the rise of corporates. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is actually to evidence there are some out there. We know the FT as an example, where they're looking at a next generation board as a pipeline for future succession. But as I say, the world of social purpose is fantastic. And looking at these blueprints, what's fantastic is there's a common template really that we can all borrow and evidence. Feel free to use the one in the book. It's out there, open source. I break down exactly how we can use it. But I think about Mission 44, Sir Lewis Hamilton's foundation. Again, this is a really powerful organisation dedicated to opportunity for young people in high-performing sports and industries. And again, they have put young people at the beating heart of what they do. And there's a beautiful quote. It's not mine, but it's the Brookings Institute. And I just want to just dwell on that just for a second, because they talk about the difference between invited spaces, which are inherently more sort of tokenistic around sort of, permission to speak, and actually the need to move to much more inclusive spaces, which are very much about shared value from the beginning. And my answer really is twofold, Sarah, is one, the answer is always or very often a next generation board, but there's a caveat. Two, if you're prepared to adopt the thinking that Shona just articulated, which is about really doing fewer things well and sustaining them, because once you have one in place, you can really lift things off, but you you have to be intentional about, are you ready and prepared to have shared voices, shared conversation, and really listen to that dialogue and tap into what it can bring? Because this is not about a tokenistic tick box. This is about something inherently much more transformational. And I love also that I think you've probably broken the record in starting at 13. So I love that.
Yeah, it's pretty out there, Ozzie. I guess, Ozzie and Shona, is there anything you want to add in the kind of what you've seen in the market on joining boards? You've probably both been at the younger end on the boards that you've joined. What are you seeing? Do you think there's a bit of market shift in this?
I think I hear a lot more people talk about it or willing to talk about it, but I suppose there's always a question around, do people talk about it because I'm in the room? And I suppose that's like I don't know the conversations that aren't in the room. When I'm not in the room, what are they saying? What are they having those similar conversations? And so I think being on the board, I remember joining one board and the average age, just they're like, oh, our age demographics have changed. And I was like, I think it's an anomaly, like dropped by like 20 years because I joined the board. And I was like, I don't think that's correct. Clearly, because I've joined, and that's why it shifted. But and so that sparks conversations, but without me being there, I'm not sure if people would have those conversations. I think what's interesting, what Rebecca said, is I'm seeing more organizations have either board place reserved for a younger board member specifically, and they put more training and support around them, or organizations creating either shadow boards or youth advisory boards that create a feeder into their main board. And I think that can be a really helpful. If I look at the stuff I was doing, they were youth advisory boards, but advising organizations in various ways, the Met one being quite peculiar because it was one of several advisory boards that were at the same level. But then those advisory boards, I think of the young people on the boards where I was chair, many of them have gone on to be boards of universities or the Youth Justice Board. And so it's a great springboard to give you the experience and allow people then to move on in their career to other places and take that experience with them.
Yeah, thank you, Ozzie. And Shona?
I think the sector I'm connected most into at the moment is the public sector in Scotland. I don't see age being discussed as much, but having gone to some training, there's definitely the people that turn up to training tend to be more diverse. And I guess that's because they don't have the natural connection to executive spaces in the same way that the non-diverse groups of people might do. And, it means that that's a space for us to sort of talk. So a lot of the time they're looking for people with lived experience. And I think there's lots of things that mean that lived experience comes with diversity as well. And so that often helps if it's disability access or justice, for example, those sorts of areas tended to, I saw a lot more people with more diverse characteristics coming through there. I think in terms of age, I haven't seen that discussion happen yet. There are often jokes made, and not at my expense, but at sort of a, if we're talking about technology adoption, there are jokes made about the diversity of the boardroom at that point. Or often I miss cultural references because I think, and this is me assuming, I'm about 20 years younger than the next youngest board member. And so there's that generational gap that means I don't get cultural references or historic references in quite the same way. So sometimes that can feel different. Nobody's doing it to make me feel put out, but they're not also intentionally, pulling young board members in at that point. On the charity that I chair, we want younger people, and we know that they don't feel as confident, and also it's harder for them to fit the commitment into their life. And so what we're talking about is having someone in as an observer who we could have a close sort of buddy relationship with for a year, and then see at that point if they wanted to join as a full board member to have voting rights and the same liabilities as you mentioned at the start, but not putting that on as the pressure at the start of the conversation with them, so that we can bring more people in. Because if I'm the youngest, I'm a generation now older than the people that we are serving, and that's not okay either. So we need to be making sure that we're bringing on the next generation and making them feel comfortable in that space. So yeah, I think it's mixed. I don't think age is as big a discussion topic as lots of other diversity characteristics.
Thank you, Shona. I think one of the things I've always been holding in tension is, do you set up something else, whether it's a next gen board, an advisory board, that has the young people that feeds in, or do you bring them onto your board? And I guess when you're talking about 13-year-olds, you literally legally can't add them as directors to your board. So that's a really good way to get their voice. But if your board is all people in their 60s, then actually there are lots of people, and I often talk about the sweet spot of kind of, in general, it's the 30 to 50 bracket that have got the skill set, have gained the exposure. The learnings in your career are incredibly steep for the first 10 years and then plateau a bit. So it's at that point that I would say there's a huge potential from that group that have generally been disregarded for board roles because people don't think they're old enough, but actually they've got the experience, they've got some different perspectives because of age that you can really get them involved. So that's always my slight bugbear when I hear about next gen boards. But there's lots of different innovation, like associate board members being brought up that have a similar set up to what Shona's just described. The NHS have done them so that you can come on board. You don't have the voting rights. You are an observer. You might get paid less for your first year. And then at the end of that year, the idea is that you'd become a full board member. So they kind of think you're nearly ready. So it's interesting to see the innovations out there. Interviews. Can you give us a sense of what your interviews have been like? Lots of people watching this will be hopefully thinking about applying for roles and going for some interviews. So maybe Ozzie first. What have your interview experiences been like?
Is it helpful to talk about my experience of being interviewed, but also on the other side of the table?
Yeah,
Roles, my background is people in HR, have also been on people committees and nominations committees, which are often the committees that help appoint or suggest appointments to the board. And I think if I'm doing interviews, the biggest thing I found that often trips people up is the distinction between operation and strategy. And by that, we mean the understanding that when you're on a board, your role is not to deliver the work of the organization. It is to advise, it is to provide strategy, to provide counsel to the rest of the exec team, to other staff members. It is to challenge and influence. And often people come into an interview and they'd say, hey, here's all the great stuff I did in my day-to-day role, and here's what I do at the organization. But we talk about the doing and not about the influencing and setting strategy and the challenging and the looking after risk. That's probably the biggest piece of advice I would give you. I'll then say when you are on the other side of the table, as I was a couple of weeks ago, my biggest tip there is to look at the strategy of the organization. Almost every set of interviews I've done, and I think almost every interview where I've been interviewed, first question is often something about the vision or strategy of the organization, where you think it needs to go from today into the future, risks, challenges, opportunities. And then the second question tends to be, what skills do you have to help them achieve that? So this is the vision, this is the strategy, how you help your organization move forward. So it's really good to think about what the organization is trying to achieve and how your skills can relate to what they're trying to achieve and bringing those two pieces together.
Thank you, Ozzie. What about your experience, Shona?
Fortunately and strangely, both interviews I've had, I was successful for. So I haven't got any more experiences to pull on than those. And I guess that's like, firstly, for me, it was about finding the right match. I think Ozzie mentioned it earlier, is that like you're cause-led, and I'm cause-led in that it's the subject matter of the organization that I'm interested in, not necessarily the role of being an ed. For some people, if they're a finance expert or legal expert, they come in with that background. So they have a slightly different approach. So I'm going to go from the cause-led side of things, because I think that's really relevant. For me, the difference actually is something Ozzie just brought up there as well, around that as a board member, your role is to challenge and come to decisions that may not be that favourable. With Visit Scotland, the first part of the interview was a presentation to talk about the experience I have and what I think that means I bring to the board. And so I opened up at the end of the presentation some challenges around where I thought we were at the time. And it actually led to a really interesting discussion around whether cruise ships should be banned everywhere. You know, like if we are working towards a green, sustainable future, and that we believe that the fundamental thing that drives everything that we do as an organization is sustainable tourism, do we stop doing all activities, allowing all activities that we see as non-sustainable in their activity? But then you have to consider the fact that cruise ships bring in a lot of tourists, they bring in a lot of money, their docking fees, for example, at the port, the fact that the port's been regenerated because of tourists coming down there, you know, all of these other things that play into it. And the chair turned around and said, well, if you were a board member, you'd have to come to that decision. So why don't you tell us whether that should be the case? And so then we ended up having dialogue and asking questions and talking about it. And for me, that was actually a really great insight into, one, how he ran the board, and two, the type of discussions that I would be exposed to. And I actually came out of the interview having really enjoyed the experience, whether or not I got the role, because I realized more what the job was, the job to be done, rather than, because it's not a salaried job, but the job to be done. And two, that I could contribute, and that I really enjoyed that debating discussion that came from that level of work. And so I guess I can't give any advice, but I would say go into it like being passionate about it. Don't just be trying to get a NED role. Like, you have to really care about the opportunity, the direction that organization is heading in, and what they do, because you're going to be involved in those types of discussions, and you're going to have thought in that space. I guess what I learned from it is that I really appreciated that I'd just gone cause focused, and that I then really enjoyed the discussion and the opportunity to debate some of those topics. So that was my experience of the interview. I was very hot and sort of flustered afterwards because it had been such an intense experience very early in the morning, but I really enjoyed it. And I think that's what then led to it being a very easy, yes, I would love to join the board, because I enjoyed the interview experience.
It's two ways. So you want to get a sense that these are people you would like to sit around a table and make collective decisions with. So they're assessing you for that, but you also need to assess them through that process. Sorry, Ozzie, I interrupted you there.
No, I should say I think it's really important about being cause-led, because I think these roles, especially if they're unpaid, like, it's not an easy ride. You have a lot of responsibility for the organization, for if things go wrong, so you really want to be committed and know what's drawing you in isn't that there's some money because it's not going to make you rich. It's that actually you are passionate about what the organization does. And that's in any sector. That could be a PLC organization and market opportunities, whatever it might be. But I think that you are passionate to give the time because it will always take more than the 12 days on the advert. There is no advert I've ever seen that is accurate. Even the ones I've put out, they're like, we think it's 12 days. It's probably not. And I think so being driven by that mission and being dedicated to that, I think is really helpful because sometimes things are really tough. RNIB went through a statutory inquiry, which was really, really difficult, which is a huge amount of time, but we stuck it out because I'm passionate about the organisation, what it does, and why I was there.
Thank
Just
you,
to
Ozzie.
pick up on the day piece, because I know you mentioned that earlier, Sarah. I guess where I see the day piece is that we had a day rate and we get paid for 2 days a month. It's not that it's 2 days a month worth of work. You know, some months it's like 4 or 5, especially in awards season when you're at the awards ceremonies and you've got audit and risk and you've got a board meeting and you've got the end of year dinner and all of these things. But some months you do, like August, very quiet, great. But we get paid for 2 days a month. It doesn't necessarily associate to like how much work you do.
No one has board meetings in August for some reason.
I've never.
That's helpful. And I guess on the time bit, the really interesting thing is because non-exec roles, you might get an email today, you haven't got a board meeting today, you get an email today, you're going to sit there, you're going to think about it, you're going to reply. No non-exec is sitting there with a stopwatch timing how long that took. And as a result, we don't know how long non-execs actually spend on their work. So it's not that they're trying to mislead you with their advert, it's actually that they don't have a clue how much time people are spending. Rebecca, you had an anecdote about getting younger trustees involved with interviews. What was that?
Yeah, I did an interestingly, that was also from the EY Foundation. And I just link into a couple of points again that, you know, I love the brain fizz in this conversation. The energy is amazing. And I think because Ozzie and Shona just touched on 2 really important pieces. One, which is around, well, many important, but I just want to pick out 2, which is one, interrogating the why both ways. And I love how you brought that up. And also about this being joyful and sort of sharing in a greater good. Because I think, you know, certainly the communities that we're part of, we've come to like bond and bind really with these communities of board members. But with that in mind, I just wanted to dwell on the EY Foundation. I've chaired the nominations committee over the years. And what has been fundamental, and by the way, this is an organisation that is the service of young people, again, supporting education and social mobility, but how we show up in an interview as an organisation really matters. So I think that reflection, again, Ozzie, you touched on at the beginning, you know, who is on the interview panel and what does that first of all even tell us about the organisation, or indeed who is not there? So for us, not having a young individual that is representative of the voices of the people that we serve is completely anachronistic. It's certainly anachronistic to an organisation that is so committed at its absolute core to the mission. Again, going back to that point around the really mission-driven organisation. So on every single interview for leadership, succession, for board trustees, we have either representation from our young trustees, and to your point, Sarah, we have both. So there are 2 young trustees who serve as full members on the board, and we also have a group of anywhere between 10 to 12 youth advisory board members. And so we draw on that amazing pool of talent. And I have to say, the punchline is invariably the most disarming questions are posed by our young trustees or by our youth advisory board members, because they really get to the heart of interrogating the why. And the second point is also about this really being joyful. So the moments invariably where you see people either, well, or not, bonding and binding with people in new ways. So and to me, they've been some of the most memorable parts of the interviews that I've done at the EY Foundation. So I thought I'd share that today. One example that's really practical, but it's stood us in good stead over the years. It really has.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess for organisations, it's that first impression when someone walks in, sits down on the interview panel, they're like, oh, you know, what do you feel at that moment? And I guess when you look at a panel and it excites you, and you've come away like Shona's kind of reaction of, I'd actually really like to be part of these conversations. That's very cool. So being there, once you are there, Ozzie, have you experienced any age bias on boards once you've got there?
No, I've not had any age bias, any issues, any concerns like that. I think I always had, starting really young, my confidence had to grow quite quickly, being in some of those rooms, doing some things that I wasn't quite used to. But I think as I moved throughout my career, it was more around actually how do I hold the space and challenge people, I think, in the right way. And I think less around age, more around just having a very different lived experience, either of that issue, but also just of being in an organization, working through some of the challenges and coming from startups similar to Shona, I just saw things very, very differently. I was like, why does this take so long? Sometimes I'd be like, but the board is around this table. We could make the decision this very minute and walk out and tell the whole company, like, it's an email. We could do it before we finish this meeting. And there's a hesitation. People are like, well, that's not the way it's done. We should do things a certain way. And I think sometimes not having that kind of organizational history of like, going to the board all the time and having a meeting and going kind of through that exec route gives you a bit more freedom just to say, we could just do this differently. This is our choice. I often say to people, I don't think we lack the skill, it's just the will to do it. And it's the will is just us around the table, and that sometimes nudges people in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think that experience is really helpful in your career to experience working for different sizes of organisations and maturities of organisations. So you get that kind of sense.
But I love Ozzie. I just got to do a quick riff on something that Ozzie said and this connection between skill and will. I have a big thing also around mindset, skill set and toolkit. And I think, again, a lot of this is going back to a big watchword I've got at the moment, which is unlearning. And I love your approach there, Ozzie, right? Ask for forgiveness, not for permission, because that's invariably what is holding us back. And if we go back to that big question of what is keeping so many CEOs up at night, will their business be relevant in the next decade? Frankly, we don't have time. And so, I love this energy of this conversation, because hopefully, again, I'm sure that's resonating with a number of people on the call. But I think, again, every nudge effect that we can all make, whether it's passing on the baton to next generations, whether it's sharing our stories, all of this, I think, hopefully, again, is just, opening up different ways of working and different ways of seeing.
Thank you, Rebecca. Shona, maybe what's your age bias been like from yourself through that journey?
I guess I shared earlier that I've been really fortunate. I've now got the most amazing pool of mentors around me, as you said. Like, it's the most amazing learning experience to be around people that do have decades of experience in leadership roles and in different industries and have gone through different things to be able to guide you. So I don't think I've experienced age bias internally in any of the boards I've been on, and it all came from myself, because when I was first told by my friend, like, you should consider a board roles, I was like, well, what experience have I got that would be of any use to anyone? And that's, I think, what we're trying to break down here is that stigma that we think we have to have years of experience rather than specific experience to go and contribute to a board effectively. You don't know about some of the governance matters. You've not been through a merger, acquisition, funding crisis, like public scandal before, but other people on the board have. And that's why that multi-generational piece is so important, because you do need people that do have experience of governance and that have got experience of going through harder times and other types of things that can sort of guide you through that. So I think all of the bias came from me. And actually, I found the first 3 months really, really difficult, and almost considered saying, actually, this isn't my space, because I hadn't been in a boardroom before. I've worked for startups. I've gone through roles really quickly. Like, you progress really quickly. The company grows really quickly. But that's very different to sitting in a boardroom, a very formal environment. And I hadn't been in a boardroom before. And so I think actually that's the bit that I struggled with myself, because I didn't know how to be me in that space. But then separately, I think organizations have a responsibility that if they're bringing someone in who is different to the existing board, or who is less experienced in the boardroom, that they really need to provide the support that enables that person to feel comfortable and feel that they can contribute. And I was given some really great advice. The company I work for day to day, I met the chair at our team away day, and I just went up to her straight away and said, I need to talk to you, and got permission from our CEO to have a chat with them. And she graciously gave me 45 minutes of her time one evening, which was amazing. And she said, you don't have anything to prove. You've been hired for what you've done before, and all they want you to do is come and use that experience to ask questions and contribute at the board level. And just having that's why you're there, and just allow that to happen. And that's been reinforced by the chair of Audit and Risk. After I said, well, I don't know anything about audit and risk, she said, that's not why I want you here. I want you here because you're going to ask the questions that we wouldn't ask. And so that's the thing that I'm trying to keep hold of, that it's not about what I have to prove in the future that I'm bringing. It's about what I've done and experienced in the past that they want me to bring. And that doesn't mean 30 years, 10 years is fine, or 15 or 20, whatever that looks like. So it's my own bias that I've been overcoming for a few years now.
Thank you, Shona. That's a really helpful insight. And I guess putting those things in place, reaching out to people, you're very, very proactive. So making sure that if you feel that when you first join, you are proactive. I remember meeting someone a few years ago, and they said they're 52. She'd sold her own company, I think for 10 million or something like that. She'd had a couple of different big executive roles, very impressive lady. And she was told by a search firm that she was too young to be a non-exec. This was at the start of my dynamic boards journey. And I was like, that is mental. And she said, what do I need to do before I'm ready? They weren't sure what she needed to do to prove that she was ready, because actually her career and CV spoke for itself. It's just that they didn't normally see someone of her age coming through. That is really changing. I genuinely do think it's changing, particularly when you come out of those top FTSE companies. But it's an encouragement to me that when you hear your kind of story, Shona, once you get in the door, this is great. The challenge is sometimes getting in the door. And I hope through Dynamic Boards, we're encouraging and inspiring you. Hopefully the market's shifting. But if you do receive any of those kind of messages, remember Shona's story, remember Ozzie's, remember that there are lots of people who do get through, and actually it's a much better experience once you're there, because that board has selected you to be there. Really important aspect. Ozzie, what surprised you when you've got there onto boards?
In your career, everyone talks about the board, and the board is this thing that is the board. And when you're there, you're like, oh, these are people. They also say some really stupid stuff. You're like, this makes no sense, but they are the board. And so I think what you start to realize is, and I think I took this back into my day job, also being on boards, is that ultimately your boards are a collection of people who are in an organization at a given point in time, dealing with issues, crises, problems, whatever it is, day-to-day running for the first time as this group of people in this permutation. And I think it really helped me to understand that actually there isn't this mysterious thing. It's a little bit like the Wizard of Oz, right? There is less magic here than you think when you look behind the curtain. It's just people. And I think that also helped me to settle into those roles as I was kind of getting older, and even when I was really young, to have more of a voice in the room. Because I think one of the worst things that can happen is in your first year or so is you're really shy. You're not sure what to say, when to speak. You don't meet very often. Yes, you might talk to people outside of boards, might meet some of the staff, but you don't talk as much. It's not like being in a normal team. And so you can feel a little bit shy. But actually for me, when I realized everyone is just a person, we're all trying to do our best for the organization. And sometimes I'm going to get it right, sometimes I'm going to get it wrong. I'll agree, sometimes I'll disagree. I think that was what surprised me most, is the board is actually not as scary as I thought it was.
Thank you, Ozzie. That was brilliant. Employers letting you out. Any quick thoughts on that from any of you?
Yeah, I'd say agree these things up front. The minute someone makes you an offer, they want to hire you. Say, oh, by the way, part of why you want to hire me is because I'm doing this stuff. Hope that's fine. Let's talk about when I'm joining. I think be upfront with people. If you don't want to do it at the offer stage, want to make the offer on your first day, sit down with your manager, talk through what that looks like, and just agree just to pilot something. Well, test it for a couple of months, see what it's like, pick the right moment. Sometimes it's helpful. You'll test it and start in January. You don't have meetings till April. But like, this is really easy. You don't have any meetings. But I think just be upfront about it. Have the conversation as early as possible.
Yeah, and manage your calendar. And if you have someone who helps manage your calendar, just be very clear about what's negotiable and non-negotiable. I just have all my diary meetings in a year in advance. We get our calendar of 6 months in advance for the next year. It's just all scheduled in. It's part of who I am, and that's what I'm hired for in my day job as well as my board role. So I actually find it harder, the board role side of things, because I'm on one of my boards the only person in full-time employment for someone else, not for my own company. They're either retired or work for themselves. And that's the harder side, is the expectation that you might be available dynamically than I can be, or like more last minute. So yeah, that's probably the side that I find a bit harder, and having to be clearer with them that I need a lot more advance notice.
Thank you. Rebecca, did you want to chip in there?
I know we're quite tight on time. I think, in one sentence, perhaps a couple, which is one of the big themes in the book, actually, from leading organisations. So we're looking at more multi-generational workplaces and maximising the opportunity that we have. And of course, QED on in terms of boards is mutuality. And I think what Ozzie and Shona have articulated it beautifully, have that open, transparent dialogue. But there's so much shared value in this. Yes, there is a trade-off in terms of time, but what you're getting, especially from somebody who's embarking on a very first board role, maybe, again, as Shona was articulating, sort of mid-20s, not least, of course, Ozzie breaking the record at 13. But that point is you have mutuality in that shared agency and that shared value. So it's not just an organisation giving away time, it's actually what they're reaping and that value they'll get back in time from the individual as well. So again, always that mutuality and always that shared value for me.
Thank you, Rebecca. One of the questions that came through is, does it tend to be easier to start off as a non-paid trustee and gain some experience before moving into paid NED roles? Who wants to jump in on that one?
That's the way around it I went. I knew I wanted to become a paid board member because that was what we'd explored as an opportunity. And I thought the non-paid role was a great way to get the governance experience that I didn't have. So when you're looking through the job description, like, they want you to understand what governance is probably. And that was a great way to do it, and to do it for a cause that really meant a lot to me, that I'd been connected to the charity in the past. But that doesn't mean that you should use that as the test bed for everything. You should take it just as seriously as you do your paid role, because you may end up being asked to be chair, which is even more responsibility and where I've ended up. So yeah, don't see it as less responsible or less serious. Sometimes you have to have harder conversations because of the financial piece, which I know Ozzie could probably touch on with RNIB, but it's actually almost more responsibility in my head, that role. And so yes, it's a good way to do it. That's how I did it. And it's definitely, I think, been a great experience for me, great learning and great people, like awesome people.
Yeah. I'd probably just add the one point is people often talk about this as their portfolio career, and you want to think about what that portfolio looks like for you. And so for me, like I still have unpaid trustee roles in my portfolio because I just enjoy doing them and I want to be part of those organizations. And so it's not always to think about this is the way to get to paid roles. It's why do you want to be on this board for this organization? Far outweighs everything, because you can be on paid boards that take up huge amounts of time. You're like, I'm not getting paid for this. The voluntary boards, which actually take up a lot of time, but it feels so rewarding, it feels so fulfilling. You're like, I absolutely love doing this. And I've definitely been in that position before.
Yeah, if you're forming a portfolio, be conscious of that. The thing that I always say is this is not a springboard to a charity role, and you guys have articulated that very well. Someone's asked a slightly technical question. If you live outside of the UK during your NED term, is that possible? What are the barriers to this? Depends on the type of organisation. Some organisations require their board members to live in the UK, some don't. So if you know that you might move away while you're on that board, probably worth having that conversation up front before you interview. Any final words? So if someone is on this call and they are thinking about applying for their first non-exec role, what would your message be for them? Shona, Rebecca and Ozzie, just a quick one-liner.
Don't get in your own way. Like, don't stop yourself from doing it by thinking you shouldn't. Just do it.
Thank you, Shona. Ozzie?
Echo, just do it, I think. And I would add, apply for organizations where you are most passionate for that first role. It shows in cover letters when people are doing this because they're churning a whole million of them out versus they're really, really passionate. And sometimes that passion, I think to Rebecca's point, makes up everything, because you can build some of the skills. We can teach you some of the stuff, but I can't teach you passion and motivation.
Yeah, and I close that on that. I think you're going back to that point around interrogate the why. Really interrogate the why around what motivates you, and connect that into, again, Shona's point at the very beginning around what impact you want to have achieved. I think we don't ask the question enough around what will have changed in the next 3 years, what will have changed in the next 6 years. I know we talk in these tripartite structures, but that's the nature of boards, right? But I think, that's really how we start to shift the needle. And none of this is about us and our watch, but those guardians really of change over time. And I'm excited by anyone applying for their first role, because, the young leaders coming through are really going to be the ones who are, tackling some of the complex problems we've got right now. We're not going to get there without it. So the final thing is also, I think perhaps every one of us has a nudge effect. And how can we pass on the baton today to Ozzie's 13-year-old self out there? Because I'm certainly up for it. Let's all do it, because we need to start earlier.
Thank you, Rebecca. As you said, a fizzy conversation. I have really enjoyed it. Thank you, Ozzie. Thank you, Shona. Thank you, Rebecca. And I hope for everyone watching this, you will be part of that nudge effect. You will be applying for your first role. We would love to hear how you get on, and we'd love to hook you up with someone to talk to if you've got an interview. Thank you again, and have a great day, everyone.